This is the Comics Alternative, episode 269. Reviews of The Lie and How We Told It, Abbott, number 1, and Punk's Not Dead, number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics. Again.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Gene and I have three really interesting titles lined up, and we want to discuss for you, our listening audience. We're going to begin with Tommi Parrish's The Lie and How We Told It. After that, we're going to look at the first issue of Abbott by Saladin, Ahmed, and Sami Kivelä. And then we're going to wrap up by looking at David Barnett and Martin Simmonds' Punk's Not Dead, number 1. But before we get into those reviews, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Well, this isn't now or again because the biggest discounts here are 50%, but still 50% is nothing to sneeze at. You got your Valiant bundle, you got your about 30,000 different DC Universe bundles or Vertigo bundles or Young Animal bundles, Marvel Legacy, a whole bunch of different stuff. And again, even at 50, the lowest discount on a bundle is 45%, which is huge.
You can't beat those prices. That's Discount Comic Book Service. The website is dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
And can I just piggyback on that for a second?
Of course you can.
Because their DCB Services sister website is In Stock Trades. Mm-hmm. And this is going to backpedal, and then it's going to come back to something that makes sense. In my day job, I work at the Herskovitz Library of African Studies. And right now, everybody's talking about Africa. And why are they talking about Africa? Black Panther.
Yes, right.
So my curator has decided to make an investment in Black Panther books and such. And right now, pretty much everything on Black Panther is in print and available. The one thing that is not in print currently are the Kirby Black Panthers, which are available along with some other stuff that's not in print in the second Black Panther Masterworks volume. Everything else, I think everything else is totally in print right now. You go to Amazon, you can buy that book, the $75 book, for $100. If you go to if you go to In Stock Trades, that Black Panther Masterworks volume, which should be $75, is like $45. You can get it there. You can't get it anyplace else, apparently. So good on In Stock Trades. You may be getting a university library order very soon.
That's good news. Now, have you been to see the new Black Panther movie?
Yes, I have.
And what did you think of it?
A, if not A+. I mean, it might be my favorite Marvel movie. Mm-hmm. It's hard because to nerd out, the first Avengers movie was fun for the spectacle that it was. Logan is a really, really good movie. The last Wolverine movie, that movie is actually an excellent film. Mm-hmm. And I think Black Panther is also. It's also visually as spare as Logan is. That's how lush Black Panther is. If you saw Thor and said, wow, that looks really cool, you haven't seen anything. It's a beautiful movie. It's got thought behind it, actual thought. The villain is not a cosmic menace like it is in almost every other Marvel movie. So the stakes are very different. The stakes are more understandable. And I was really, really impressed with it.
Okay. I haven't seen it yet. I've heard a lot of great press about it. Now, you're singing Black Panther, the movie's praises. I'm really behind in terms of my Marvel universe, cinematic universe watching. So I feel like I need to get caught up. But
you don't actually.
I know you don't. I just feel like I need to.
Okay.
And I just don't go out to the theater as much as I used to. Another thing is, I don't know, I'm a bit of a contrarian by nature, so if everybody is raving about something, I become suspicious. It's like, can it really be as good as everybody says?
Oh, believe
that's
me.
Just my nature. And so
No, I was guarded going in.
You were guarded?
I was guarded. I had heard great things. I'm like, I really hope I like this, but let me see, because I really wanted to like Doctor Strange.
But you didn't. See, it's another one I didn't see.
It was another Marvel movie. I liked seeing the fact that it existed, but it didn't really do much for me.
Okay, so Gene highly recommends the new Black Panther movie. At some point, I will see it. I may not see it soon, but at some point in life, I am sure to gaze upon it, and maybe after the big hoopla dies down.
Well, life has things that has to be done first sometimes.
Well, Gene, there are a couple of things that we need to mention before we get to our reviews.
Okay.
And the first thing that I want to announce is a bit of news.
News about news. Excellent.
You remember last week when we were going through the contact us list and I was mentioning the various social media platforms that people can use to get in touch with us and communicate with us. And I said, there may be something else in the future. That's what I want to announce is we have set up a new means for people to communicate with us. And this is through Discord.
What is Discord?
Okay. I am still in the process of learning about using Discord. From what I can gather, it's very similar to Slack, although maybe you could call Discord a Slack for gamers. It's a platform that a lot of gamers use in order to communicate. You can create channels on Discord just as you can on Slack. There is, I believe, more of a multimedia or visual media and audio media component to Discord because it caters primarily to gamers. But the reason I set this up, and I know we're not a gaming podcast, but there are a number of podcasts that I've noticed that are starting to set up Discord accounts. I don't know if we're going to use it. I don't know how effective it will be, but I nonetheless set up a comics alternative account on Discord. So if you guys want to be a part of the Discord community with the comics alternative, then go to our contact page, and there you will find a link that will give you the option of joining up. Basically, you click on that link and it's like an invitation, right? You can sign up for our Discord channel. I don't know how we're going to use it yet, but I nonetheless set it up.
Well, if it exists and it's on the internet, it seems like the comics alternative is there in one form or another, so we may as well do it.
Yeah. So anyway, there you go. I wanted to announce to everyone that we do have a Discord channel set up now, or a Discord account. But another thing that I'd like to share is the number of correspondences we've received over the past week since you and I last recorded, Gene.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
That's right. It is mail time. And we got a surprising number of messages, the majority of them being on YouTube over the past several days. Again, since we last communicated. And yeah, I was surprised as well. Now, we did get one really nice message on Facebook from Jeff Weber. He is actually commented on last week's episode, which, was our romance or Valentine's Day special, where you and I, Gene, looked at a number of romance comics. And he wrote on our Facebook account, "Thanks for making this podcast. I just checked out the Valentine's episode. Glad to see indie comics getting some love."
Nice.
That's right. Thank you very much. Yes, we appreciate the kind words, Jeff. We also got quite a number of messages via YouTube, as I had mentioned, and no one really commented on YouTube on last week's episode, but on episodes that have gone up over the past several months. So, for instance, there is one person on YouTube called Daddy's Girl who had, several weeks ago, maybe about 4 weeks ago, made a comment on our YouTube channel under the video with the Gabriel Bell interview from last summer.
Nice.
And she had commented about a month ago that her comic, she says, quote, "Her comics aren't like Curb Your Enthusiasm, because she talks directly to the audience and breaks the fourth wall." And I think probably me, made a comment when Andy and I did the interview with Gabriel Bell, something about Curb Your Enthusiasm. But anyway, Daddy's Girl had said the other month, "No, it's not like Curb Your Enthusiasm." And then I responded to Daddy's Girl soon after that, "Yeah, but they're also comics," which is another reason why it's not like Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is a television show. And then a couple of days ago, Daddy's Girl responded to my response by saying, "No, they're not." I'm not exactly sure what that means. Is Daddy's Girl saying that Gabriel Bell's comics are not comics? I'm not sure. Or maybe there was just a bit of miscommunication going on there.
Yeah, asynchronous communication is never easy.
Right. Well, especially when you're dealing with social media.
Right.
And then someone else responded on our a video on YouTube with our video with Rich Tommaso. And this is Callie Radnuzel. And I may be mispronouncing that name, but Callie writes, "For such a shockingly amazing artist and storyteller, I can't believe this artist, Rich Tommaso, isn't more famous." I agree.
Thirded.
Yes. And then yet another individual commented on YouTube with our interview just recently with Bill Cardelopoulos and Ben Catcher. And this is by Patton Spatz. Okay, Patton Spatz wrote, "Can you guys have on John Chad to talk about his comic Bad Mask?" Well, Patton Spatz, probably not, because Gwen and I reviewed Bad Mask back in the fall of last year, so that's kind of an older publication. However, John Chad does have new things coming out in the next few months, and I know at least one thing that he has coming out is another book in First Second's science comic series.
Cool.
So that may be an occasion to have John Chad on the show. But Patton Spatz, thank you very much for that comment. And the rest of you guys, Daddy's Girl and Callie, for your comments on YouTube. And again, Jeff's for his kind words on Facebook. And then one other thing I want to mention. I said the Discord seemed to me like Slack for gamers. We do have a Slack channel. We've had a Slack channel for a few months, and it doesn't get a lot of usage. Every now and again, people post to it or communicate, go back and forth. And I just want to mention before we start our reviews for this week, we have a lot of buildup before the reviews, I guess, over the past several days, I've had a really interesting conversation with Milton Lawson, who participates on our Slack channel, and he had commented last week about, what was it? It was, I think, our discussion or our interview with Jeff Lemire from last year, where Lemire was saying that he didn't really like the term slice of life to describe the kind of comics that he primarily does, or at least he's probably best known for. Real life narratives, right? Mm-hmm. True to life.
Right.
Whatever you choose to call them. And so Milton and I have been going back and forth a number of times about this dilemma. What do you call these comics? I agree with him completely. Slice of life is clunky. It's not very descriptive. I tend to use the term realistic, with a small r, not realistic or realism with a capital R, because that could mean something else entirely in terms of, let's say, literature or narrative. But I know Milton had suggested that maybe literary comics may be a useful term instead of something like slice of life or realistic or realism. I see where he's going, but the problem with that for me is that the word literary is quite loaded. And if we call something a literary comic, that may come with particular baggage that we wouldn't necessarily want that comic to have. Also, people may think that you're being highfalutin by calling something literary and other things non-literary. So, when it comes right down to it, what Milton and I have been going back and forth about is the fact that there's really no easy way to designate comics that are more realistic in nature, as opposed to more straight out genre like sci-fi, horror, what have you. But it's been fun, and this is the reason why I set up the Slack channel for occasions like this. So, Milton, thank you very much for engaging me in this ongoing conversation, and I hope we can continue doing this, maybe with other terms.
Maybe we could call it quotidian comics. But quotidian sounds a little pejorative at the same time.
Yes.
Words are hard.
Well, Gene, what you just said may be a great segue into this week's review titles, because we're dealing not only with words, but also with images, which can also be quite hard, depending. Now, the first title that you and I are going to look at is by, and I'm not sure if you pronounce the name Tommi or if it's Tommi. It's Tommi, Tommi Parrish. And this is The Lie and How We Told It. This was released by Fantagraphics in late January. Have you encountered Tommi Parrish's work in the past?
Well, before we started recording, you reminded me that Tommi has some stories in Now, and I blanked on that totally. I mean, the style looks familiar, and I couldn't place why, but it would have been Now where I saw them. Yeah,
in fact, that's I think my only exposure to Parrish's work is through the first two issues of Now. That first issue came out back in, I guess, the fall, and then issue 2 came out maybe the very beginning of this year, and we've reviewed both of those on the podcast. So I remember Parrish's work from those two issues of Now. But that was my first exposure, and I looked them up, and Parrish, the first book was, or at least an earlier book, is by, it's published by 2D Cloud. This came out at the very end of 2016, Perfect Hair. Had you heard of that?
I have not seen that one, no, unfortunately.
No, and I hadn't either, and it was surprising because I'm pretty much aware of what 2D Cloud does. Not that I get everything that 2D Cloud puts out, but I'm aware of some of their titles. So this one really flew under my radar. So I apologize to Tommi Parrish for not having known about Perfect Hair, but we definitely know about this new book, The Lie and How We Told It. So, Gene, what are your initial thoughts of this narrative?
My initial thoughts is that I think I need to read it about 5 more times. And that's not a slam. It's just it's narratively elliptical. It's visually unique. It's not very unique. It's just unique because you can't qualify unique. But
right. And thank you for saying that, by the way.
And there are storytelling. There are some visual storytelling choices that I don't quite know why they're there. And again, since as I've been drawing more and more myself, I know that there may not be a reason why they're there. Sometimes things just seem to work or be appropriate. But there's a lot to contemplate just visually on the pages. And there's also a story within a story here as well. And I'm still trying to parse together exactly how the two match up.
Okay, now I do want to talk about that story within the story. But I'm curious, when you said that there are certain visual characteristics that, in essence, you're scratching your head over, and you're not exactly sure what to make of them, but they seem to be significant in one way or another. What specifically were you referring to?
Okay, well, one thing is just a matter of style, which is not really it's not something to question. It's that most of the figures are, I guess you would say, grotesque in the sense that there's bodies are not exactly misshapen, but they're proportioned very oddly. Most characters have very kind of large, monumental bodies and little tiny heads.
Right.
So there's as soon as you look at this book, you can tell that it's a Parrish book. And I think unless their style changes a lot, this is like a very clear visual hallmark. There are hints of a couple other things in there. There's almost a little Mazzucchelli in there every once in a while. But the kind of exaggerated bodies and things like that are interesting to look at. But the other things are like there's Tommi. You say Tommi, I'm going to say Tommi.
Okay.
One of us are right. Tommi plays around a lot with layering and transparency. Sometimes things are only drawn in outline rather than fully filled in, or part of something will be an outline, part of something will be fully filled in. The book is primarily painted, so that gives it a visual. It's painted, but it's a kind of flat planes. It's not exactly like flat color, but they're very kind of clearly defined flat planes and stuff like that. And it looks interesting, and some of the compositions or some of the storytelling elements, you don't know why something necessarily is see-through, like somebody's hair might be see-through. And the first thing we see is like, oh, they missed that. But clearly there are choices being made. Occasionally characters, like they will lose their hair for whatever reason, or
different colored hair. Yeah.
Different colored hair, or the proportions will change. But I think a lot of the story is about trying to understand yourself and the kind of self that you put out to the world as well. So when things are kind of malleable or fluid, I think that's part of what's going on narratively as well. So narratively and visually, those two things kind of they kind of jive together for me pretty well.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said what you did in terms of the fluidity or the malleability of the theme and how the visuals in some way kind of reflect that, because that's what I was thinking as well. And, I'm with you on the way that Parrish represents anatomy, with the larger bodies, the smaller heads, and many times from one page to the next or one even panel to the next, you don't have consistency in terms of physical form, which is okay. But another thing that struck me was the opaqueness of some of the images, or at least at times, right? Because on certain occasions, you will see an object or a part of an individual that seems to be solid, and then in another panel or on another page, that same component will be a little opaque or see-through, or you have only its outline instead of anything filled in. And yeah, I didn't know exactly what to make of this, but since one of the themes of The Lie and How We Told It is this fluidity of definition, right? How we see ourselves, how we define ourselves, especially when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality, and I think sexuality in particular with this book. It just struck me that the fluidity of the art, of the visuals, kind of went hand in hand with what the book was about, in some ways at least. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, sometimes you're questioning things. Like, I'll throw it out there. Our two main characters, the man is named Tim, and the woman is named Cleary. But Cleary, I wasn't entirely sure if Cleary was supposed to be a man or a woman at first. Just visually, the cues were a little unclear, especially when on page 2, when Cleary asked Tim, "How are you anyways? It's been too long." He responds, "Totally. Good, man. I've been good." So the kind of uncertainty, the man there was kind of throwing me a little bit. Although, again, in the very first page, he does say to her, Cleary, which does sound more like a woman's name than a man's name. But
right.
But still, just the visual cues. He's got stubble. He's clearly coded as male. Cleary is a little more ambiguous.
Right. And in fact, I had the same issue, not really an issue, that's probably not the best word, but I guess the same question immediately on the opening pages. Is Cleary male or female? Doesn't really matter, but I didn't, could be, non-gendered. But that name Cleary, I thought, is that female or not? But again, given the conversation between Tim and Cleary, which gets back to what we were mentioning in terms of the theme, it really doesn't matter. Why do we need to determine whether one character is male or female? To certain degrees, that does become significant in terms of the conversation that Cleary and Tim have. But again, that comes back to this whole issue of malleability and the indeterminacy of certain things. And, maybe with the exception of the story within the story, I would argue that, if you're going to define what The Lie and How We Told It is about or what actually happens, I would say it's a conversation. It's a conversation not really like My Dinner with Andre, but it's, I guess, to some degree somewhat similar in that it's the dialogue between and the back and forth between Tim and Cleary that provides the action. Now, they don't sit at a table like Andre and Wally do in My Dinner with Andre. They move. So they go from one place to another to another. At one point, Tim goes to the bathroom. Cleary talks to someone else. But again, it's primarily a conversation between the two. Right. These individuals catching up. It has been a long time since they saw one another. They used to be really close. They're no longer close. There may or may not have been something there between them that could or could not have bloomed into something else. And they hint at that. But again, that's primarily the action of The Lie and How We Told It.
Yeah, definitely. The conversation is certainly central, and it's part of it is some of it is Tim coming to terms with himself, and part of it is Clea opening up a little bit to herself, but also seeing Tim for who he is or who he has failed to become, because they were so, like you said, in high school they were very close friends. She says at one point that did I actually write it down? There was something about like for a while my whole world was him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but now he's still, but he's a man, but he's still a boy on the inside.
Exactly, and one of the things that makes that statement quite poignant is the fact that he's about to be married. And this is not a spoiler because we learn this almost at the very beginning. Right, when Tim first meets Cleary. In fact, he meets Cleary when he's checking out at a grocery store or a convenience store, and Cleary actually happens to be the cashier. And so she's about to get off from work. And so that's when Tim says, yeah, I'm about to get married. So here's a guy who, and Cleary's right. He is probably more of a young kid or a boy than he is an adult, the way that he acts, some of the things that he says, but he's about to enter, so to speak, an adult world by getting married. Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting because they do meet up, and it's clear that Cleary's more interested in connecting with him than he is with her to a certain extent, because even when we get to page 3, he's like, we should catch up she says, we should catch up sometime. He said, totally. She's like, I'm done in 5 minutes. And he goes, So he's keeping things on a superficial level, but she's like, let's really talk to each other. And he's not, he does it, but he's a little uncertain about, he's uncertain about a lot of things.
He's a little more superficial than Cleary.
Quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it was interesting to see her immediately reach out and him kind of acquiesce. You can tell it's not the thing that he was planning to do, but he's like, well, okay, I suppose. Because again, clearly he does still have feelings of friendship for her, but I think he thought it was just going to be like, oh, hey, how's it going? Oh, long time no see. And he was just going to go on his way doing whatever it is he wants to do. But she's reaching out to try to actually reestablish that kind of personal connection that it seems that, again, with the little boy thing inside him, he's not comfortable with. He doesn't seem to be comfortable with any sort of long-time personal connection. That marriage that he says he's gonna is impending. I have my doubts.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're left with, or we're supposed to come away feeling
right
by the end of this book when they part company. Now, I want to talk a bit about the aforementioned story within a story. And this takes place on, I don't know, what is it, page 16, 17, when Tim goes in, well, again, Tim and Cleary, they're getting to know each other again, and they share some wine that Tim has with him, but then they quickly run out, and then they say, or Tim asks, oh, well, let's go get some more. You want to? And so they walk to a liquor store, and while Tim goes inside to get more wine, Cleary sits outside waiting for him, and she sees lying on the ground a book of some sort. So she picks that up, and this is a book that has the title, One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand. And so she begins reading it. Now, what we find beginning on page 18 and running to page 62 is the book that Cleary is reading. So we don't see her reading the book so much as we actually see the book that she's looking at, that she's actually reading. And so that lasts for about, 44 pages or so, 48 pages. And then toward the end of this book, from page 107 to 122, when I think she and Tim part company, she's on a subway and she's looking at the book. So again, we're given access to what she's looking at. And one of the things that differentiates this book, One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand, from the book that we're holding in our hands, The Lie and How We Told It, is that the book that Cleary's reading is in black and white.
Right, exactly.
So it's the only part of this text that is not in color, that doesn't have that painterly look that you referred to earlier. And the page, it's interesting in that the number of pages that are devoted to this book that Cleary's reading, One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand, is about 60 pages. That's not quite half of this 123-page book. But when I was reading this, it didn't seem that the book within the book took up almost half of this text until I went back and then counted the pages and thought, it does take up almost half.
Yeah, and part of that is because it reads more like the cover of the book says it's a novella, but as you go through, it's more like it's almost like an adult picture book, because the verso is one illustration and the recto is words, is just the narration itself. So it's not. I mean, Scott McCloud, I'm not sure he would call this comics. I don't care if it is or not, because it's part of a book of comics, so it doesn't matter. But it's like you said, it's clearly drawn by the same person, but stylistically it's immediately different because of the black and white line. It's line work. It's almost like if Jos Swart and Ivan Brunetti and Tama Finland all had a kid. That's what this book looks like on the inside.
Now, you were saying earlier that you appreciated this story within a story, but you didn't know exactly what to make of it. And I feel similar, because I was thinking about the title of this book that Cleary picks up, right? One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand. And what that refers to, what this book within the book is all about, is the story of another relationship. And you have this man who has a relationship with a woman. And at first I didn't know that this was a woman, but apparently it is. The man seems to be, I don't know, what would you call middle class, upper middle class. He lives in a, fairly well-off suburban neighborhood. The woman that he's involved with is a stripper. And so, she lives in an apartment. And it's about how the two of them are together, and it's told from the point of view of the woman who isn't really sure that she wants much, if anything, out of this relationship. And I won't, spoil anything about how this book within the book ends for us. But it's like The Lie and How We Told It, the relationship between Tim and Cleary, the relationship between these two people in One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand is problematic. They seem to get along, but perhaps not really. Each of them seems to want something else. And the title, again, One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand, refers to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't that refer to an occasion where the man was inside her apartment and the woman was aware how different her apartment was from what he was used to in terms of his home? And so that title refers to probably what she was thinking, don't think you can understand me just by coming into my apartment and seeing what you're seeing.
Right, and the whole book is coming from the whole book within a book. The novella is coming from her point of view as well.
Right, she's the vocalizer here.
Right, and One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand. So what she thinks is that when he sees her apartment, she believes she understands the kind of a negative way he's seeing that. We don't know that he sees it that way, but that's what she feels.
Right,
and she also knows how she feels when she's in his house as well. And she seems to feel that he's very superficial, where she's actually quite deep, although if you look at her apartment, she doesn't seem to be that way at all. So there's kind of an inversion there. But I'm not sure how open she is to him either. She's for all kinds of reasons. There's all kinds of reasons why she wouldn't necessarily be open to him as well. But it's about these kind of ideas of understanding each other that you don't, that you think you know, but you're not, that you're kind of guessing at. Exactly.
And that gets back to the title of this story within the story. One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand. To me, what I've been trying to do in understanding The Lie and How We Told It, and I agree with what you said earlier, this is a book that multiple readings would, I think, be necessary to let it really sink in and think about even more. With this story within the story, I couldn't help but think that solidified another major theme of this book, and that is the inability of individuals to really understand one another, which may be kind of a bleak theme, and maybe that's something that Parrish didn't intend. And so they're listening to this, I hope, and thinking, no, you misread my book. But what I come away with in terms of The Lie and How We Told It, we have Tim and Cleary getting together. They once had some kind of friendship relationship of some sort. Now they don't. They kind of leave each other about where they were when they met one another at the beginning of the narrative. And then we have a relationship in this book within a book that doesn't seem to be that positive either. And it all comes back to this inability to really slip into another's skin, which again is not the most uplifting message, but perhaps realistic.
Yeah, definitely. And we've got, again, like you said, we've got a big chunk of the book within a book at the beginning, and then a big chunk right near the end until the very last page where Cleary finishes reading it. And not going to go too much further with that. But it just feels like Cleary is getting something from the story. But again, I think she's been able to open up. She was able to open up to herself, to Tim a lot more, and Tim even than the two characters in this book do, in the book within a book. And Tim even says at one point that it's easier for he finds it much easier for her to talk about stuff, basically sexuality. He says she's very easy. It's very easy for her to do that. It's very hard for him to do that as well. So he's still trying to understand himself as well. Not only is he uncertain of his sexuality because he's not gay. He makes really clear that he's not gay, but he is always the top. But yeah. he's not gay, and he's also all about to get married. And he also decides he's going to go hit on the hot bartender also because hey, he's not married yet. He's completely immature. She sees that. At one point, he realizes that about himself also. And so he's trying to come to grips with himself. She's coming to grips with the fact that this guy that she hasn't seen in a long time pretty much is the same guy she knew back then, but she's grown a lot since then.
Right. Now, you mentioned a moment ago that she may have come away from this book that she picks up, One Step Inside Doesn't Mean You Understand, with some kind of understanding. I'm not entirely convinced of that, because when we get to that last page and she does what she does with this book, I ask myself, has she learned anything? Has she gotten anything out of this narrative? I don't know. That's very similar to what I mentioned earlier about this inability to really understand other people, right? To walk a mile in their shoes, so to speak. And again, it's kind of a bleak message. Does she learn anything from this book? I don't know. I'm not certain. And that brings me to the title of this actual book that we're discussing, The Lie and How We Told It. So what is the lie? Is the lie this feeling that I think most people have, that we can understand other people as well as ourselves? And if that is a lie, then how do we frame that? In other words, that's the how we told it part, right? How do we explain relationships? How do we explain our assumed ability to know the kind of person that we actually are? As you mentioned, Tim says that, he's not gay, he's a top. Although, there have been times in the past where he's been with a guy.
Right.
Again, is that the lie, or is that the how we told it part, or both?
Yeah, I think the definite article is throwing us, because I think that there are a lot of lies all the way through the book.
Yeah,
and so it's but like you said at the very top of at the very top of our conversation, this book is primarily about a dialogue. It's about the attempt, at least what looks like communication. And so if it's a lie in how we told it, this book is all about telling. Mm-hmm. But there's telling through the words that you use. There's also telling through the actions that you choose to take as well. And I think Tim clearly is telling lies in lots of different ways.
Yeah,
and Cleary is coming to terms with the fact that she did in the past, but I think she's less likely to tell lies of one form or another now than she was when she was younger. Tim is, if anything, dug into that the trench of living in a lie.
I think it's a great book, and listeners should definitely seek it out. Again, The Lie and How We Told It by Tommi Parrish.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, this is Parrish's first book with Fantagraphics. Now, again, they have had works in the first two issues so far of Now, and I don't know if Parrish has something coming out in issue 3 of Now. But this is their first Fantagraphics book. I'm glad that they are at Fantagraphics. And this is no slight against 2D Cloud. 2D Cloud does great stuff. It's just that 2D Cloud doesn't have the exposure, and it doesn't have the publicity. It doesn't have the finances that Fantagraphics has. And so this is going to definitely give Parrish more exposure. And for that, I'm thankful.
Right, yeah. Norton's distributed, Fantagraphics is distributed by Norton, I think, still, mm-hmm. Right? So, yeah, this book is going to get out there in ways that a kind of smaller comics publisher just simply can't. And that's just economics and feasibility.
Exactly.
Yeah. And one thing, I did read one interview with Parrish in Paste, and they talked about the story within a story, and what they say, and I actually wrote this down, when asked about the story within a story, Tommi says, that idea mostly came from a section of this horrible jock comic called Watchmen. I've never heard Watchmen called a horrible jock comic before, but
jock comic?
Jock. Yes.
Is it an athlete jock?
Well, words are open to interpretation. But I mean, if we're talking about the you started off talking earlier on about the conversation we're having on Slack about the day-to-day comic or the quotidian comic or whatever like that. This clearly falls in that genre. And compared to this, Watchmen with the hyper muscular men and fights and things like that, I can see how you could call that a jock comic. If where your head is at is pure slice of life, person to person understanding on a very again realistic with this, like you said, small R level, Watchmen is much more about jocks. I mean, I love Watchmen. It's very complex in what it does, but its concerns are genre concerns primarily, whereas The Light and How We Told It are very much about, like you said, human concerns, how people relate to each other, how people relate to themselves. You can ask those same questions about Watchmen, but there it's overblown and metaphorical. Here it's this is our life.
Right. Well, and each of them are attempting to do something completely different.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. It's comparing apples and fiberglass, definitely. But I just thought that was an interesting turn of phrase that I had never seen Watchmen described that way before. But again, this is why this moment is so good, because, 20, 30 years ago, most people doing comics came from a traditional, fairly mainstream comics reading background. Today, you've got tons of people who create comics because they understand that this form exists, but they're not versed in the history. They don't have to be versed in the history to create what they want to create. So they don't have those preconceived notions. They don't have those preconceived narrative points of view, narrative tricks. So this is somebody taking a trick they saw in a book that has very little interest to them, but using that narrative trick to their advantage and transforming it in a way that I never would have thought about Watchmen reading this book until I read that interview. And I was like, wait a minute. Yeah. But that makes me, again, what makes me want to go back and read this again, because the comic within a comic in Watchmen, the pirate comic, has very clear thematic resonances to the larger superhero story. So it makes me want to go back to this again and try to look for those kind of resonances as well. Because even if Parrish kind of dismisses it as a horrible jock comic, still there was something about this narrative technique that was striking enough to say, I can do something with this from my own concerns as well.
And, it's not as if stories within stories are unique to Watchmen.
Right.
Literature is littered with those kind of examples. So
yeah, Frankenstein, one of my favorite movies is the Sargasso manuscript, which is all about in embedded narratives and stuff like that. But this one, when you look at it through those eyes, it's clear that somebody is reading a book within. It's not necessarily like somebody telling a story. Somebody's reading another text. But again, like you said, it's also not unique to Watchmen or to this book either. But there's a clear connection there that I think is really interesting, because they actually choose to do a slightly different stylistic thing as well. Whereas in Watchmen, the pirate comic doesn't look all that different from the regular comic.
Well, Gene, you want to move on to the second title that we are looking at this week?
Okie doke. And that one is Abbott by Saladin, Ahmed, Sami, Kivelä, and Jason Wordie from Boom Studios.
That's right. This came out actually last month in January, and you and I had considered discussing this first issue of Abbott on an earlier show, but we didn't.
A couple weeks ago.
Yeah, but we thought that we would deal with it this week because, both of us liked it well enough, and the second issue hasn't come out yet, so we wanted to strike while the iron was at least not cold. This is an interesting narrative. I think there are going to be 5 issues in this mini-series. And who knows? It could be just the first arc of this title. There may be another volume or another narrative arc of Abbott, on down the road. Who knows? I guess it depends on what the sales like or for this first arc. But basically, it is the story of a reporter by the name of Elena Abbott, and it takes place in the 1970s, and I think it's 1972 in Detroit. And she is a reporter. She's a very good and dogged reporter. she's someone who is respected by her colleagues. However, she's a woman and she's black. And because of those two things, she's not as respected as she could be if she were a man and white. And although I don't think at least in this first issue, Abbott is primarily about race, especially race during the 1970s in the United States, is a big part of what's going on. In other words, it's not just the window dressing, but it is a significant part of the cultural, social setting that propels what happens for the most part in this first issue.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, even our first page there, where it says Detroit 1972, the very first panel, we've got white people and black people walking down the street. We've got this really interesting kind of collage-y montage for the first 2/3 of the page with, in the background, you see a couple of newspaper articles. Nixon steps up bombing, Detroiters deployed on one side, and the other side is Wallace. Segregationist Wallace wins Michigan. Mm-hmm. And we've got a little map of kind of Detroit itself, and you've got this kind of very subtle X happening there also, which, just given the racial terms behind here, might not be incidental. I'm not sure, but she mentions about halfway through the story as well about the fact that there are two Detroits. Mm-hmm. There's the white Detroit and the black Detroit, and the white Detroit would be really happy to leave if they could leave that black Detroit behind. There's something like that. So it's certainly there. And again, you said that she's got strikes against her because she's black and she's a woman as a reporter, but she's also been focusing on black issues, and the police are not very happy with her because she broke a story with hard evidence about
police abusing a young black boy.
Exactly, and the police are not happy about that. And she confronts them in a couple of different places because she's a crime scene reporter. She goes to the scenes of the crime, but very few of the officers will give her any actual information, and they make comments about her. She was able to talk to a photographer at one point. She has one friend on the force, basically, that she can talk to. So I think like you said, race is there. It's deep, and I'm almost disappointed that it's not the main hook of the story.
And yeah, I wanted to say something about that. So a moment ago, I said that race is important in this first issue, but it's not necessarily linked to everything that goes on in this first issue.
Not everything, no.
Because what happens later in this first issue, and I don't know if this is approaching spoiler territory, so I won't go into too much detail, but I will say that it's a horror twist. And it's something that I really didn't expect until I got about maybe halfway through this first issue. And there's a scene where Abbott is home and she's relaxing and she drifts off to sleep. And we're given access to apparently her dream world, right? Mm-hmm. And so she's dreaming, remembering about being with someone named Samir. And at first, we don't know who this Samir is. Later on, we learn that this is someone that she used to be involved with. And there's something going on. There's something kind of scary and spooky. But, and I don't know, we don't have page numbers here, but at one point, this thing, this creature, this horror thing.
The Umbra.
Is that what that is?
Yeah.
Okay.
She says later that Samir called it the Umbra.
Oh, okay. But when she's dreaming, this thing, this Umbra, is grabbing Samir, and he's yelling, "Run, my love, go!" And she says, "Samir, no!" Now, because this is part of her dream, at first I thought, okay, well, this is just kind of a freaky dream thing that she's having, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a more realistic narrative, or slice of life, if we wanted to call it that.
I'm still on board with quotidian.
Yes, okay, quotidian. But then later we learned that this wasn't just the product of her dream, that this apparently actually happened. And that's the thing about this first issue that has me wondering how will this play itself out. I guess it fits. It's just that I didn't expect it, right? I mean, first, we had a realistic quotidian narrative where she is a reporter. There's a series of strange cases where at first, a horse and then a human,
a young horse, yeah.
Right, then a young male, are killed or slaughtered in a very unnatural way. And, okay, so that's a great mystery. But then we have this kind of strange horror infusion later in this first issue. And so this strikes me as something, I don't know, maybe like Kolchak, right? You know, that old 70s show.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much so.
With, Darren McGavin.
Yep.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, it's something that I hadn't actually thought about until just now. You said you were kind of not necessarily put off by, but shocked by the kind of the supernatural element that shows up, and I was too.
It had me in a quandary. Let's just say.
But go ahead and look at that cover again. Should have guessed it from the cover. Never even thought about that.
I did notice that.
I saw the cover, and I basically saw our main character, and I didn't really look at what was surrounding her. If you go back and look at it, I was like, well, of course something like that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I didn't catch it at the time because I was so engrossed in the story itself and the storytelling. Right. I really liked again, like I said, I was almost disappointed because of the supernatural element, because the main story itself, the characters and the situations were so interesting in and of themselves to me, and I also really like the art. The book takes place in 1972, and the art it doesn't feel like it's a throwback, but it feels it feels 1970s. It reads as 70s to me. It's clear and it's direct and it's kind of dirty.
It does, yeah. It does have kind of an older 1970s comic look to it. Even
though like the coloring is more is like watercolor and stuff like that. It doesn't look like a 1970s comic, but it feels.
Well, some of the figures
like
do.
The figures.
Yeah, I'm looking early. Yes, I'm looking early on at the faces of not only Abbott, but also some of the reporters and the police there. And it almost, these faces, these anatomies do look something as if it could have come out of a 1970s comic.
And that is not a slam at the storytelling at all.
No.
It's really good. Actually, one thing
that would be a compliment in my book.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really liked is it looks like it's on page 9 of the PDF that we're reading, but when Abbott is actually walking to her job, and I love the bottom of that page, because basically what she's doing, she's walking and she's lighting and smoking a cigarette. Well, a couple of cigarettes, pardon me, as we go through. But that last tier of panels down at the bottom, there's some overlapped inset panels of just her mouth and her hands smoking and relighting this cigarette. She walks past the Detroit Free Press. She walks past the Detroit News, and the Detroit Free Press building is all nice and shiny. The Detroit News has like big, beautiful windows in front, and the Detroit Daily, the paper that she works at, is like any other building with a little sign tacked above the door. Mm-hmm. And just like the three panels focusing on her kind of move downward. Those three panels of the three different newspapers move downward. You can see just visually what's happening there. She's gone past the big stuff.
Right. There's definitely a diagonal progression.
Right, and she's moving past the important stuff, getting to the place where she's able to have this job. And again, like you said, she's got the support of her colleagues, but especially her main editor, who, for all his even though he says Negro instead of black, and she corrects him on that, he still backs her up, even though he knows it's a hard thing to do, because he's got the higher ups. The publishers are coming in and giving him hell because of the stories that she's been producing. But he does back her up. But he says he fought in World War II, so he's bridging the generations. He's trying really hard. He's got, again, he doesn't quite have the lingo down yet, but his heart, at least so far, seems to be in the right place.
Right. And his name is Fred, although, if we called him Perry White, we wouldn't be off base.
No, or Lou Grant.
Or Lou Grant. Well, he's not as big as Lou Grant.
Right.
And he's not as funny as the Lou Grant on Mary Tyler Moore. And, of course, Lou Grant on his own show was much more serious.
Yeah.
Speaking of the 1970s, but yeah, I mean, there's something about the editor Fred that's a little too, at least within the context of comics, a little too stereotypical. I mean, again, how could you not look at this figure and think Perry White? You know, the cigar, the whitish hair, his shape, and his gruffness is a part of that as well. And, you know, that gets me to, I mean, I like this first issue. I want to go and eventually read all of the issues of this first narrative arc. But I have to say that one of the things about this first issue is that it appeared to me that Ahmed, as the writer, maybe was trying a little too hard to set the context that he was attempting to set. What I mean by that is partly this Perry White comment, right? That this hard as nails, kind of tough, but has a good heart kind of editor. You know, being very much like Perry White, it just strikes me as, Saladin, Ahmed trying a little too hard to get this across. Another thing is there are so many 1970s references in this first issue. And the way that I felt is that, you know, Ahmed was trying to hammer home, this is the 1970s. But I don't know if in the actual setting of 1970, there would have been so many references to that same decade, right? So, I mean, I understand what Ahmed was attempting to do here to set this stage, right? This temporal setting of it taking place in the 1970s, race relations, women's lib, and all of this. But there are all these little comments. Like at one point, even I think one of Abbott's colleagues mentioned something about, the women libbers or something to that effect. And you know, it's like I kept thinking, don't hit us over the head with this. I mean, we get the setting because on the very first page, we know that it takes place in Detroit in 1972. Let's go with that. And maybe have a few 70s references here and there. But, you know, you have the race, you have the women's lib, you have the state of Detroit, you have the white flight. You know, a lot of the things that define the 1970s, I think, are definitely baked into this first issue.
Even the title of this chapter 1 is Just My Imagination.
Yeah.
So we got a little Motown thing happening there as well. But I'll be contrary to a certain extent here.
Okay.
You and I are of a certain age. So all those 70s references,
we get
them. We were alive then. This is reminding us. I think that a lot of the readers, I'm hoping a lot of the readers are going to be a bit younger than us also, and it will seem less obvious and more kind of signposting, sort of. I mean, it didn't feel redundant. It seems like it's almost like you feel like it's almost a little redundant to have that much stuff in there. For me, it was fine because it all felt sort of as a piece, but also I think if you were a younger, a less experienced in the course of life reader, you may remember some of this stuff from your history textbook if you got it, and if you didn't, you might be picking up on some things also. I guess I'm a little more open to the possibility that the readers might not be as old as us.
That's true, and that's a good point, and I definitely see where you're coming from there. But okay, what if, let's say, the setting was the 1960s, and there was an overabundance of 60s references, right? So there, references to, it takes place, of course, in San Francisco. There's flower power. There are references to the Beatles. There's mentioning of the Kennedy family. Again, you just throw in all of these 1960s signifiers, or let's say the 1950s, right? So it looks something almost like out of the set of Happy Days. There are Elvis references. McCarthyism is mentioned, and Eisenhower is a part of the narrative at some point. Again, I mean, there are all of these things. I didn't think that it was a debilitating characteristic. In other words, it didn't turn me off of this first issue. It just, I don't know, it was noticeable. But you make a good point that for those who aren't as familiar with the 1970s, then, these may be useful signposts, right? These various references to help set a time and place.
And again, in 1972, I was all of 6 years old, so I mean, it's not like I was deeply entrenched in all this stuff also at the time, too. But it just, It didn't feel as overt to me, I guess, as it did to you. To me, it felt a little more natural as things were going through.
Yeah. Another thing about this issue, and this doesn't bother me, but damn, there's a lot of smoking.
It's 1972.
Yeah, exactly. Well, not everybody smoked in 1972. It's almost like that. It's almost like that one scene in the movie Body Heat when, and it's been ages since I've read Body Heat, but it's actually quite a funny scene. This is when I guess a will is being read, and they're taking a break after reading the will or in the midst of reading the will, and the camera pans around the table as people are kind of relaxing and sitting back, and every single person lights up a cigarette. And I just thought that was a funny scene. And there's something almost funny about the amount that Abbott in particular smokes. But, I do appreciate the way that Ahmed and Kivelä are using smoking kind of strategically as a visual marker. A great example is that scene that you mentioned, right? When she's walking down the street and you have, her walking by different newspapers before she gets to hers, and the differences in the buildings. And then we have this progression of her smoking, which suggests the passage of time. And so it is used effectively. And of course, I would say that this is definitely a noir narrative, a crime noir comic with a horror twist.
It's a 70s.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
So, smoking's a big part of that as well. It's one of those, genre icons.
Smoking, hard drinking. Yeah, like page, in our PDF, page 13, where she's writing a story. We again, you said the emphasis on the smoking. We've got those 3 inset panels again of those 3 shots of her ashtray.
Right.
And without those 3 panels of showing that ashtray getting fuller and fuller and fuller, we wouldn't necessarily realize how much time is passing between those 3 panels. Well, there's also the light in the first panel and the dark in the last panel. But even still, it's a really nice kind of visual metaphor to show how hard she's working, how long she's working.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and even though you do have, as you pointed out, the earlier panel toward the top of the page being light and the panel, the long panel at the bottom is dark, it's not near as effective as that series, that vertical series of cigarette butts filling up the ashtray.
Yeah, no, I love the little touches like that throughout here.
So, yeah, this is an intriguing first issue. I want to read the rest of Abbott and see where it goes. I want to be convinced that this horror twist toward the end, especially of this first issue, makes sense. And I hope it's not ill fit.
Well, my guess is that the horror is probably going to overtake the narrative to a certain extent.
Right.
And again, on the one hand, that's unfortunate, but on the other hand, that's clearly where this is headed. Again, even from the signaling on the cover. And I like this first issue so much, I definitely want to see where it goes.
Yeah,
and I'm willing to see, just because I liked the setting and the setup and everything so much, and I'm intrigued by how this is going to fit in. I know it's going to take over things to a certain extent, but I definitely want to see how this stacks up as it goes through the 5 issues.
Well, Gene, let's move on to the final title that we're going to be looking at this week, and this is Punk's Not Dead, #1. This is written by David Barnett with art by Martin Simmonds, and this is part of IDW's Black Crown imprint. This is the latest Black Crown comic, and I think it's the 4th title that they've done, because there
it's
is
close.
Right, there's Kid Lobotomy, then there was Assassinistas, and then there's the Black Crown Quarterly. But definitely this is the most recent, right? So this is the newest title of the Black Crown, Shelley Bond's Black Crown imprint. Now, have you read the other Black Crown comics?
I've bought the first issue or 2 of Kid Lobotomy, just mostly because Peter Milligan I've liked for a long time, and I think Tess Fowler can draw like a demon, but I haven't actually read them yet.
Okay. Because I've read,
but I'm interested in it, but it's in my pile, and I just haven't got to it yet.
Right. So I've been reading at least the first couple of issues of Kid Lobotomy, the first couple of issues of Assassinistas, and I do think that I have a pretty good feel for Black Crown titles. Black Crown, and I've said this on previous podcast episodes, because we have reviewed both Kid Lobotomy and Assassinistas in the past, that this has a Vertigo feel to it.
Early Vertigo feel, definitely.
Yeah, and of course, this is Shelley Bond's imprint, and Shelley Bond used to be with Vertigo, and some of these creators have also done things with Vertigo in the past. You mentioned Milligan, but also Gilbert Hernandez, who does the artwork with Assassinistas, has also worked in Vertigo. So it definitely has that kind of feel, and in fact, I would argue that the Black Crown titles that I've read so far feel more like Vertigo than the Berger book comics that are coming out of Dark Horse, although they do have a Vertigo feel to them as well. It's just that the kind of supernaturalness of what we find in the Black Crown titles so far seems to scream Vertigo more than otherwise.
Yeah, early on. So it's well, the titles themselves are kind of throwbacks, and like you said, and yeah, it feels a little early Vertigo to me, and for me that is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But also, it's not aping early Vertigo, but there's a lot of the same sort of. It's kind of a feel more than like I'm not sure that Vertigo would have done a book like this, but it doesn't feel dissimilar.
Oh, they would have.
In tone.
Like Punk's Not Dead? Yeah. Of course they would have. And they did. I mean, there were Vertigo titles that definitely referred overtly to Punk. Yeah. And of course, vast, maybe majority of Vertigo titles had this supernatural feel to them in some form or another. Yeah, I mean, this definitely has that Vertigo feel. Now, the story is interesting. This is a narrative centered on Fergie Ferguson. So it's a young kid named Fergie Ferguson. And how would you describe him? He is, his relationship with his mother is strange because his mother is someone who likes the public eye. And early on in this first issue, we see Fergie and his mother on, I guess, what would be the British equivalent of like the Jerry Springer show.
Yeah, exactly.
And we learn that Fergie's mother goes on these shows and she creates this false narrative about what life is like for her and her family, the sensational aspect of it, in order to get paid, I guess, right? So this is what she does for a living. And so it's not the most positive relationship for the son, Fergie. But at one point, Fergie and his mother are at Heathrow Airport. They're getting ready to go back home after, one of these bookings on this sensationalist television show. And Fergie sees what seems to be, at least, the ghost or the spirit of Sid Vicious. Which brings us back to the title, Punk's Not Dead, right? So we get Sid Vicious, one of the earliest of punks, who is dead, but apparently not dead. And Sid has, as he tells Fergie, has been stuck at Heathrow for years and years and years, and for some reason he can't leave. He doesn't even know why he's still around as a ghost. But there's something about Fergie that once this quote-unquote ghost of Sid Vicious meets Fergie, he can leave the airport. So basically, Sid hangs with Fergie for the rest of the narrative and becomes his coach and supporter in some interesting ways. Now, I say it seems to be the spirit of Sid Vicious because one of the things that I found interesting is at the very end of this first issue, the writer David Barnett mentions that, and this is not a spoiler because Barnett comes right out with it and says, this is not really the ghost of Sid Vicious. And he doesn't really tell us what exactly this figure, this spectral individual thing is, but it's not the actual ghost of Sid Vicious. And so there's still a big question mark. It's like, if it's not Sid Vicious's ghost, then what the hell is it? Is it some kind of spirit or specter that thinks it's Sid Vicious? It seems to be the way that Barnett is describing it. It's really strange.
Yeah, again, and Sid in the comic introduces himself as Sid.
Right.
He doesn't say Sid Vicious. That text piece in the back is like a little bit. He does say that he's a spirit. He's the spirit of 77. Sid is the spirit of punk rock.
Right.
Which is interesting. At first as I was reading it, I just assumed Sid was Sid Vicious straightforward. I was like, well, that's a kind of a strange appropriation to take. It's kind of like you're having a comic book where Frank Sinatra, this ghost of Frank Sinatra, is a main character. But that was odd. But he's clearly marked as a spirit. What's also interesting, did you pick up the dream thing like I did? Sid is very much in a Sandman mode. You talked about Vertigo earlier on,
right?
He's pale. He's got the black hair. He dresses in black. Well, that's kind of goth, whatever, almost. Even though he's punk. But I mean, look at his word balloons.
Right, it's in black. I thought of that.
It's white text on a black background. It doesn't have the drips that Morpheus's word balloons has, but he clearly it's. I don't think you can help but think. I mean, again, if you're of a certain age who read certain comics back then, it feels like I couldn't stop thinking about Dream and Morpheus while I'm reading this, and so that kind of those are signals that are maybe sending me in a different direction, but maybe not, because again, when we get to the end, we say, well, he's not Sid Vicious, he's the spirit of punk rock, and right. Punk is, and again, our title also is Punk's Not Dead, but there's no apostrophe,
right? Yeah,
so,
good point.
So who are these are punks plural that are not dead? I'm curious to see how that plays out also.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just a grammar nerd, but I tend to think that plural there, as opposed to a possessive or a contraction, means something.
Right. Now, another thing about this first issue that I find curious is, I guess, the other part of the narrative, in addition to the Fergie-Sid relationship, is this character, Dorothy Culpepper.
Right.
And I'm sure that in future issues, the story of Dorothy and the story of Fergie and Sid will come together. And I can anticipate in what ways they may come together, because Dorothy is part of this almost X-File-like organization in the UK called the Extra Usual Affairs Department. What exactly is the Extra Usual Affairs Department? I don't know. Something like the X-Files with the FBI, I assume.
She's kind of a Ghostbuster.
And she is, right. When we first see her, she is, well, okay, we learned something at the very end, and I think this is in, again, Barnett's brief essay in the back, that Dorothy is a lot older than we think she is. But, when we first see her in this issue, she's quite old. There is a flashback at one point to her as a young woman, and this is of the PDF. It's on page 19.
Yeah.
Right. And she doesn't look punk. She's mod, definitely.
She's totally mod. She's at Carnaby Street. She's got that. She's got the mod target on her dress.
Exactly.
She looks very Carnaby Street there. Mm-hmm. But even in that first the first time we meet her, when she captures a little pest problem, as she calls it, some kind of weird creature. What we see behind her, it's not really painted out of the walls. We've got more of those mod targets there. It's like we're looking at Keith Moon's chest, only really large.
Her earrings have that mod target.
Her earrings, I missed that part. I was looking at the big targets without seeing the small targets there. But yeah, so she's got this clear connection to not just the 60s, but to kind of mod culture 60s. And being a Who fan, this is very, very close to my heart. Mm-hmm. And again, clearly so far she seems to be an antagonist, not a protagonist that we're supposed to identify with. But I'm really interested to see what her story becomes, because she's crotchety, but she's very good at her job, which is a job that is kind of odd. And but there's clearly more to her story than we've seen so far.
Right. So Okay, how are you coming away from this first issue of Punk's Not Dead?
Oh, it's a joyous mess. There's stuff everywhere, but again, the relationship between Fergie and his mom is very odd. I'm not sure I've seen anything quite like that before. Basically, his mom is she's a huckster. She's running con games left and right. He's clearly not happy to be part of it, but he's kind of got no choice. I mean, she won't even let him call her mum in public.
Right.
In case there are any eligible bachelors listening. So that it's. I mean, this could be played for pathos and drama, but it's played a little more as humor. But again, it's kind of fitting with the kind of overall wacky mod sensibilities that are still kind of trickling down. I mean, even in the current day, that Dorothy Culpepper, even though she looks like she's in her 60s or 70s, she's still basically she could almost be Emma Peel.
Yeah, older Emma Peel.
But I mean, in clothing ways, clothing,
yes,
her clothing hasn't changed all that much.
Right, exactly.
So there's some kind of a larger connection there. So she's going back to the 60s. Sid's going back to 77. So I'm guessing there's some kind of a weird time tachyon thing happening here also.
Wow. You know, I didn't realize it until you just mentioned, Punk, Sid Vicious, or Sid in the 1970s. But, two of the titles that we've looked at this week have something to do with the 1970s. We didn't plan it that way.
Nope. Well, let's say we did. Sure,
give
why
us
not?
more credit. Yeah,
this is that 70s podcast.
Oh my God,
I'm sorry.
That who knows, that may be our subtitle for this episode. Gene, three really interesting titles that we discussed for this week. We started off with Tommi Parrish's The Lie and How We Told It, which came out last month from Fantagraphics. Then we looked at the first issue of Saladin, Ahmed, and Sami Kivelä's Abbott from Boom Studios. And then we wrapped up with Punk's Not Dead #1, a new Black Crown title from IDW, written by David Barnett with art by Martin Simmonds.
This was a good group. I mean, they're usually good groups, but I enjoyed all three of these a lot.
Yes, I did as well. And if you want to find great titles like the ones we've just discussed, then you definitely should check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find great discounts every single month on comics, graphic novels, and bundles. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can reach us at our email. We've got an email for the show, which is two guys, spelled out, TWO guys, at comicsalternative.com. If you just want to yak at me, I am Gene, with a G, at comicsalternative.com. And Derek?
I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest. We have Slack channel, and now we have a Discord channel. We also have a YouTube channel, as many of you know, because you've been responding on that channel.
Thank you very much.
That's right. We appreciate that. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on the blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's a lot of places to find us.
Yes, and I don't know if it's going to grow anymore in the near future, but I'm going to kind of draw the line there with a new Discord channel. I got to learn Discord, and then we can go from there.
Are we on Tinder yet?
Are we wanting to meet another podcast and hook up with it?
I'm just saying. I mean, we seem to be on almost everything, so...
Yeah, that's true. Maybe that's on down the road. It depends on how lonely we get.
Yeah.
So all the more reason for you guys to contact us through a variety of different means so we won't be lonely.
Please contact us.
Yeah, save us from getting a Tinder account. So Gene and I will be back next week. And in fact, next week is going to be interesting because we have a special episode. We're going to do a publisher spotlight on Kush. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. I got a lot of reading to do still.
That's right. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, what happened?